Sometime before October 8th, 1772, Phyllis Wheatley, a slim African slave in her late teens, met with 18 gentlemen so august that they could later allow themselves to be identified publicly as the most respectable characters in Boston. You have to have a lot of strong feeling for yourself to say that. The panel had been assembled to verify the authorship of her poems and to answer a much larger question: was a Negro capable of producing literature? This is the first paragraph of Henry Louis Gates' book, The Trials of Phyllis Wheatley, from which this message draws tremendously. The trial that Phyllis Wheatley endured was not a court trial. It was an examination. She entered the room, perhaps in Boston's town hall, carrying manuscript consisting of 20-odd poems that she claimed to have written. The men present were there to determine whether her authorship of those poems was authentic or a hoax. And these 18 men were known to everyone in Boston. Thomas Hutchinson was the royal governor of Massachusetts. Andrew Oliver, the colony's lieutenant governor, notable clergy. Joseph Green, a literary figure of his day. Harvard figures, and John Hancock. Yes, the John Hancock. The majority of these men were slaveholders. They were not welcoming of the thought that a Black woman could write poetry. They were a group of the most powerful persons in the Massachusetts colony, and they were all white, and they were all obviously men. Phyllis was brave to face them, though one might imagine that she was also terribly scared. The intersection of race, gender, wealth disparity, free and slave, and power in this situation must have been intimidating. But she arrived, and she had her poems, and she was ready. The young woman who had become known as Phyllis Wheatley came to Boston on July the 11th, 1761, only 11 years earlier. She arrived on a slave schooner named the Phyllis, from whom her slaveholders, the Wheatley family, would bestow her name. And of course, she took their last name as her own as well. She was probably, when she came off the boat, she was probably about 7 years old, and probably a native Wolof speaker from the Senegambian coast, what we would now know as the Senegambian coast. Susanna Wheatley, the wife of a prosperous Boston merchant, purchased her to be a house servant. Phyllis was naked, only covered by a carpet. Boston at that time had 15,520 people. 1,000 of them were Black, only 18 of whom were free, and no Black children were permitted to attend the local schools. The Wheatley's daughter, Mary, without any explanation to history, began to teach their family slave to read. It must have happened almost immediately when Phyllis entered the household. Phyllis was a quick learner and also learned to write only by watching other people write. Mary also taught Phyllis English, Latin, and the Bible. As early as 1765, Phyllis Wheatley wrote a letter to a clergyman in London. That was 4 years after being purchased by the Wheatley family. She was able to speak, read, and write in English within 4 years. And she was fluent, not just sort of the kind of command of a language like I would have after 5 years 4 years in France, I would never be anywhere where she was. She had learned so much. That same year, within 4 years of coming to North America, being taken and brought to North America, Phyllis Wheatley wrote her first poem. In 1770, when Phyllis was about 17, she wrote a poem about the Boston Massacre and an elegy on the death of the Reverend George Whitefield, the popular English evangelist. The poem was passed from Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, Philadelphia, and crossed the Atlantic and was read in London as well. It did so well that Mary Wheatley decided to publish her slaves' poems in a single volume in 1772, if enough subscribers could be found to underwrite the cost of publication. This did not happen because not enough Bostonians believed that an African slave had the intelligence to write a poem. The prevalent view at the time was that African people were human, but only barely. Many people believed that people of African descent were closer to apes than to human beings. The august figures in Boston were assembled to examine Phyllis Wheatley about literature and theology. They asked questions like, who was Apollo? How did Zeus give birth to Athena? You need to know that in a lot of her poems, she cited stories from the Greek myths. They weren't going to ask her about the Bible because a lot of people knew about the Bible in those days, or thought they did. Afterward, to their credit, they all signed an affidavit affirming, attesting their opinion about her poems. They wrote, "She has been examined by some of the best judges and is thought qualified to write them." They didn't say that she wrote them, but they knew that she was qualified to do so from the questions they had asked and her answers. This affirmation was still considered inadequate by publishers in the American colonies, and the Wheatleys were able to encourage a London publisher to bring out the manuscript. The Countess of Huntingdon had taken up the project. She was a early follower of John Wesley, and she and Phyllis Wheatley, as both being in the Christian evangelical circles, had been corresponding. Phyllis Wheatley dedicated the poems on various subjects, religious and moral, to her. It became the first book of poetry published by a person of African descent in the English language. In the English language, not just in the United States, in the English language, throughout the English-speaking world. It was widely discussed in Europe. The French philosopher Voltaire and future American Admiral John Paul Jones both sent letters mentioning Phyllis's poetry in conversations they had about it in London and Paris. In 1773, Phyllis and her owner, John Wheatley, went to London to oversee the publication of their book. They met with notables like the Earl of Dartmouth, an abolitionist, and Benjamin Franklin, who was advocating for the American colonies in London. I could only imagine what it must have been like to introduce to a prominent abolitionist, "This is my slave Phyllis." She's, and then have them talking to each other. I think that must have been a bizarre situation. She was still the Wheatley's property. Upon returning from Britain, Phyllis sent letters out about the distribution of her book to men who were bringing it to the colonies. She gave instructions how the book was to be laid out, and she demanded that that there be inside the book there be a print of her composing a poem. So that's the only image we have of hers from that book. In 1775, she wrote a poem honoring George Washington and corresponded with him and later met him when he was in the Boston area. She was given permission by the Wheatleys to be responsible for her literary career and her finances. It is, however, the story does not end there, because there's another renowned figure in American history whose writings were linked to Phyllis Wheatley's. Thomas Jefferson felt compelled to write about Phyllis Wheatley not long after she was dead. Jefferson recognized that her achievements were being cited by abolitionists, that an American slave could write poetry worthy of being read was evidence that shook the core arguments of racism and therefore slavery. Persons of European descent throughout the Americas were using slaves with the justification that Africans were not mentally able to accomplish much. Jefferson's book in 1788, Notes on the State of Virginia, contained critical commentary about Phyllis Wheatley and about Africans and African Americans as well. He writes that her poems are below the dignity of criticism. Jefferson does not deny that Phyllis Wheatley wrote her poems, but he states that they are not quality work and are mere imitations of English literature. He goes on to state that persons of African descent cannot create art. These are his words. Comparing them by their faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory they are equal to whites, in reason much inferior, as I think one could scarcely be found capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid, and that in imagination they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. There are elements of history that people who are not white in this country carry that those of us who belong to the dominant culture are unaware. Their narratives are passed down, often secretly within their communities. White Americans could not and would not hear their truth. For example, my father-in-law told me that all the African Americans he knew in his part of Virginia in the 1930s and 40s knew that Thomas Jefferson fathered a child with his slave Sally Hemings. It was common knowledge. It was also known in that community that Jefferson sold his own daughter. Jefferson's example teaches us something about human beings that it took me a long time to understand. My experience in my youth with very intelligent people was such that I believe that intelligence was related to morality, as if being able to figure things out and to be able to see a larger picture would make a person more moral or more ethical. My father's second wife came from a very intelligent family, and as a teenager and into my 20s, I attended gatherings with her extended family. They were brilliant people. They were people who had PhDs in physics, people who were chemists, people who were mathematicians, people who were journalists, people who were physicians, people who were biologists. They were a really bright group of people, and they were wonderful and they were charming. And I thought that all smart people were like that. I held on to this belief for a longer time than was reasonable. It took attending the University of Chicago to disabuse me of the idea that intelligent people were more benevolent and ethical. Jefferson was very intelligent. So was Richard Nixon. Neither was moral in his actions. At least Richard Nixon never so divorced from his sold that he could sell his own daughters if he had the opportunity. Thomas Jefferson's attacks on Phyllis Wheatley, and indeed upon all Black people, as artists and creators, were not so remembered by the dominant white culture of this nation as they were by African Americans, especially those who were writers themselves. For some, Thomas Jefferson was a creator of African American literature, as Black writers bore the burden of proving that Jefferson was wrong. This is an aspect of that genre to which I was unaware until I learned about Phyllis Wheatley. Jefferson's critique of her, of all African Americans as writers, has been something that Black literary figures have carried, a piece of history, for centuries. As Henry Louis Gates writes, if Phyllis Wheatley was the mother of African American literature, there is a sense in which Thomas Jefferson can be thought of as its midwife. Gates adds, Jefferson's comments about the role of their literature in any meaningful assessment of the African American civil rights became the strongest motivation for Blacks to create a body of literature that would implicitly prove Jefferson wrong. African American writers have struggled with the need to create and the full knowledge that, like Phyllis Wheatley, their work would be ignored or overly critiqued. They still felt the powerful impulse to write, to create. African American poet County Cullen wrote that God gave some African Americans the calling to write, and that the calling was not simple. It was a difficult thing. He writes, yet I do marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet Black and bid him sing. Phyllis Wheatley did not live long enough to read Jefferson's critique of her work and of Black people in general. After the publication of her volume of poetry in 1774, the Wheatley family freed her. She still worked for them, but that was only for a short time, less than a year. When the British occupied Boston in 1775, Phyllis Wheatley moved to Providence, Rhode Island, where Mary Wheatley, the woman who had been the girl who taught her to speak English and read and write English, and her husband lived. A year later, Phyllis moved back to Boston. In 1778, she married a Black man named John Peters, who was a grocer and sometimes lawyer. Phyllis continued her efforts to write a second volume of poetry. In 1779, she advertised 6 times in a Boston newspaper her need for subscribers for another book, which she planned to dedicate to Benjamin Franklin. The ads failed to garner the needed subscribers. There was, after all, a revolution going on. And people may not have been thinking as much about poetry as they were about survival and fighting the British. Phyllis gave birth to 3 children, 2 of whom died before her. On the birth of her 3rd child, her husband was absent. She found work as a scullery maid at a boarding house. This was not something that she was strong to do. Phyllis and her 3rd child died on the same day in December 1784 from pneumonia, poor and alone. She was only 30 years old. Her husband is thought to have sold the only copy of her 2nd manuscript for the book she was planning. Several poems from this manuscript have, however, survived. Some have criticized Phyllis Wheatley for not being more outspoken about the evils of racism and slavery. Most of her poems reflect her evangelical Christian faith and are also given to coping with the death of a loved one. She writes in one poem that she was grateful to be taken from Africa because she was able to become a Christian in America. For that, some have reviled her memory. But they do so not really understanding that when she wrote that, she was still a slave and in a slaveholder's home. One of the realities that shaped Phyllis Wheatley's life is that almost all of the poetry that she composed was while she was a slave. She could not be very candid about her feelings when she was still the property of the Wheatley family, though they were more willing to grant her more freedoms than most slaveholders did. Even as a slave, Phyllis Wheatley corresponded with major figures. It is said that the Wheatleys were a peculiar family who associated with abolitionists while being at the same time slaveholders. It would be interesting to understand their perspective as well. Phyllis Wheatley did, however, write a poem that spoke of her feelings about slavery. This is inside a larger poem entitled, "To the Right Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth." And remember that these verses were written while she was a slave, and she was writing them to a leader of the abolitionist movement in England. She writes, "Should you, my lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood, I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. Stilled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his baby beloved. Such my case, that I can then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway." This piece of that poem tells us of the trauma that Phyllis Wheatley must have felt when, like so many people in that era, she was taken from her parents when she was 7 years old and taken to another world. She has no knowledge of what happened with her parents. The words that stand out in that snippet of poetry are love of freedom, the common good, feeling hearts, cruel fate, snatched, pangs, sorrows, seized his babe beloved. Tyrannic sway. Those words might be the most that she felt permitted to write under her circumstances of enslavement, her trauma. If the African American writers who came after her found her life and poetry too calm, that they might reflect on how difficult it was for Phyllis Wheatley to be so intelligent, so constrained, and so isolated. One reads her poems and realizes that she had no community to which she could join. The closest that Wheatley writes of community is that of the Christian evangelical church. And even then, the reader suspects that she is speaking of white religious community. There were Black Christian churches in Boston, but she was probably required to attend church with the Wheatley family. Unitarianism did not formally exist in Boston during Phyllis's lifetime. As she died young, we cannot discern how her faith might have changed, as most of us had changed our faith during our lifetime. Phyllis did write poems condemning atheism and deism, but her perspective might have evolved over time. As I perused the complete writings of Phyllis Wheatley, I was struck time and again that the poems were by a slave. The letters were written by a slave. The instruction to the printers on the layout of her book of poetry were written by a slave. And these are not images of Phyllis Wheatley. These are images that somebody reconstructed of what they thought she might have looked like. We do have one picture of her that appeared in her first volume of poetry. And I thank Karen for providing those to us. The men who examined Phyllis Wheatley were probably struck by this. She had intellectual poise and confidence. They were probably astonished. Thomas Jefferson feared Phyllis Wheatley and what she represented. Her volume of poetry proved to the world that people of African descent could create art, that their minds were not like those of animals, that they could think. As they could think, they deserved human rights. The economic system that sustained Jefferson and the Southern planter class, slavery, was built upon the lie that some types of human beings were innately inferior to others. Jefferson knew the truth, and he felt compelled to lie to his own advantage. We know this truth in our time as well. There have always been Phyllis Wheatleys in this nation, brilliant people who were and are never given the opportunity to contribute to our culture because of prejudice. Our society wastes human creativity and the potential for us as a species because the cultures we have inherited categorize people and do not encourage everyone to flower. Evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould famously wrote, "I am somehow less interested in the weight and convolutions of Einstein's brain than in the near certainty that people of equal talent and have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops. I am somehow less interested in the weight and convolutions of Einstein's brain than in the near certainty that people of equal talent have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops." Phyllis Wheatley's poems prove that people of African descent did have minds to think and capacity to speak to matters of ultimate concern. Our Unitarian movement was not founded on fixed beliefs about God, but upon faith in human beings to discern for themselves in supported religious community the truth that met the criteria of reason and spoke to their lives. Such can only happen in the presence of freedom and encouragement. At the root of Unitarian Universalism is the belief that we humans have been endowed with intelligence and creativity. Phyllis Wheatley and so many others reveal to us that creativity is a trait that strengthens us all. May we overcome the prejudices that chain us to beliefs that curtail us. May the faith that we proclaim bring us to the day when people are affirmed to be who they are and to realize their potential. So be it. Blessed be. Amen.